Do you know why the 10 plagues were imposed on Egypt? Was the only reason to free the Jewish people? If you are interested in learning more about the answer to these questions, watch until the end. Please take the time to like and subscribe. Let's get started. God imposed the 10 plagues on Egypt for several key reasons. Number 1. To demonstrate his supreme power over the false gods of Egypt and show that he alone is the one true God. Each plague directly challenged and exposed the impotence of specific Egyptian deities that were worshipped. Number 2. To force Pharaoh to release the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Despite repeated warnings and opportunities to free the Israelites, Pharaoh stubbornly refused until the final, devastating plague of the death of the firstborn sons. Number 3. To reveal God's glory and power to the Israelites who had lost faith in him during their long enslavement. The plague showed the Israelites that the God of their fathers was alive, worthy of worship, and able to redeem them from bondage. Number 4. To foreshadow and teach about God's plan of redemption through the Passover lamb, which pointed to the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. The final plague required an act of faith by marking their doorposts with the blood of the lamb to be spared. The first plague of turning the Nile River into blood was a judgment against the Egyptian gods Apis, the god of the Nile, Isis, goddess of the Nile, and Khnum, guardian of the Nile. The Nile was considered the bloodstream of Osiris, who was reborn each year when the river flooded. By turning the Nile to blood, God demonstrated his power over the gods the Egyptians worshipped and the source of their livelihood. The second plague of frogs swarming Egypt was a judgment against the Egyptian goddess Hecate, who had a frog's head and was the goddess of fertility and renewal. By unleashing a devastating infestation of frogs, God demonstrated his power over Hecate and the natural order the Egyptians associated with her. The frogs would have been seen as an uncontrolled force of nature, mocking the supposed authority of Hecate. Additionally, the plague of frogs made the land ritually unclean according to Egyptian religious practices, undermining their beliefs and way of life. The sheer numbers of frogs described in Exodus 8 verses 3-4, invading even the most private of spaces, would have caused great distress and hardship for the Egyptians. The third plague of gnats or lice was a judgment against the Egyptian god Set, the god of the desert. By having Aaron strike the dust of the ground to produce gnats, God demonstrated his power over Set's domain. This plague was also significant because the Egyptian magicians could not replicate it with their secret arts. As Exodus 8 verses 18-19 states, the magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." The magicians' inability to reproduce the plague was an admission that this was an act of the one true God, not merely sorcery or magic. By having the gnats come from the dust of the earth, God showed his sovereignty extends even to the most mundane elements of creation. The plague arrived without warning to Pharaoh, indicating it was a swift judgment in response to his continued hardening of his heart against God. The magician's confession that this is the finger of God marked the first public acknowledgement that the plagues were the work of the divine, not merely natural phenomena or trickery. The fourth plague of swarms of flies was to demonstrate God's power and authority over the Egyptians and their gods, while also making a clear distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. As stated in Exodus 8 verses 22-23, God sent the swarms of flies to show that he is the Lord in the midst of the earth and to put a division between his people and Pharaoh's people. The plague afflicted the Egyptians but did not affect the Israelites living in Goshen, proving God's sovereignty and his ability to protect his chosen people. Additionally, by unleashing swarms of flies throughout Egypt, God was judging the Egyptians for their worship of certain fly-related deities like Keper, a dung beetle god, or Uatchet, a fly god. The overwhelming presence of flies would have undermined the supposed power of these gods and exposed their impotence before the one true God. The plague also served as a tangible sign to Pharaoh, demonstrating God's control over nature and his willingness to bring severe consequences if Pharaoh continued refusing to let the Israelites go. Despite this display of divine power, Pharaoh remained stubbornly defiant, hardening his heart once again after the plague was removed at Moses' plea. The fifth plague of Egypt was the pestilence or death of livestock, as described in Exodus 9 verses 1-7. This plague was a judgment against the Egyptians for their cruel enslavement and oppression of the Israelites. By striking down the Egyptians' cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, sheep, and goats, God demonstrated his power over the livestock the Egyptians depended on for agriculture, transportation, and wealth. This would have dealt a severe economic blow to the Egyptians. Additionally, this plague may have been a direct challenge to the Egyptian bull gods like Apis and Bacchus, which were seen as sacred fertility deities. By killing the cattle, God showed his dominion over these supposed deities the Egyptians worshipped. Importantly, Exodus 9 verse 4 states that the livestock belonging to the Israelites were spared from this plague, making a clear distinction between God's people and the Egyptians. This highlighted God's favor and protection over the Israelites, while judging the Egyptians for their oppression. Despite witnessing this mighty act of God, Pharaoh remained stubbornly defiant, hardening his heart once more and refusing to let the Israelites go, as recorded in Exodus 9 verse 7. The death of the livestock was meant to humble Pharaoh, but he persisted in his rebellion against God. The sixth plague of boils or skin sores inflicted on humans and animals in Egypt was a judgment against several Egyptian deities associated with health and disease, such as Sekhmet, a warrior goddess sometimes seen as the bringer of disease, Sunu, the pestilence god, and Isis, the goddess of healing. By causing painful boils and sores to erupt on the Egyptians and their livestock, God demonstrated his power over these supposed healing deities the Egyptians worshipped and relied upon for protection from illness. The plague exposed the powerlessness of their gods in the face of the true God of Israel. The seventh plague of hail was a judgment against several Egyptian gods associated with the sky and crops, including Nut, the sky goddess, Osiris, the crop fertility god, and Set, the storm god. As described in Exodus 9 verse 18, God warned that he would send the heaviest hail that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded until now. This devastating hailstorm, accompanied by thunder and fire running along the ground, destroyed everything exposed in the fields, plants, trees, and livestock. The hail ruined the crops Egyptians depended on and worshipped Osiris to protect. It also challenged the supposed authority of Nut over the sky and Set over storms. Importantly, Exodus 9 verse 26 notes that only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, there was no hail. This made a clear distinction between God's judgment on Egypt and his preservation of the Israelites, further exposing the impotence of Egyptian gods. Despite witnessing this mighty act of God, Pharaoh again hardened his heart and refused to let the Israelites go, as the plague ended. The devastating hailstorm was meant to humble Pharaoh, but he persisted in his defiance against the one true God. The eighth plague of locusts was a judgment against several Egyptian gods associated with crops and vegetation, including Nut, the sky goddess, Osiris, the god of crops and fertility, and Set, the god of desert storms. As described in Exodus 10 verses 12 to 15, God sent an east wind that brought swarms of locusts to devour every plant and crop left in the fields after the previous plague of hail. This devastated what little remained of Egypt's agricultural production and food supply. By unleashing the locusts, God demonstrated his power over Nut, the sky goddess the Egyptians believed controlled the elements and weather. The swarms blotted out the sky, challenging Nut's supposed domain. Additionally, the locusts consumed all the crops, undermining the authority of Osiris, the god of vegetation and fertility worship to ensure bountiful harvests. This plague made a mockery of Osiris and the Egyptians' dependence on him. Some also view the locusts as a judgment on Set, the god of desert storms, since the swarms were brought by an east wind from the desert regions. Their sheer numbers and devastation exposed Set's impotence before the true God of Israel. The ninth plague of darkness upon Egypt, as described in Exodus 10 verses 21 to 23, was a judgment against the Egyptian sun god Ra, or Amun-Ra, who was one of the most prominent deities in their religion. By enveloping Egypt in a thick, tangible darkness for 3 days, God demonstrated his power over Ra, the supposed god of the sun, light, and creation. This darkness was so intense that it was described as a darkness that could be felt, immobilizing all activity and movement in Egypt. The ancient Egyptians regarded Ra as the creator god and the personification of the sun itself. His rising in the east symbolized life, while his setting in the west represented death and the underworld. By blotting out the sun's light completely, God showed that Ra was impotent and had no true power over light or the natural order the Egyptians associated with him. Importantly, the Bible states that all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings during this plague of darkness. This made a clear distinction between the judgment God rendered on Egypt versus the light and deliverance he provided for his people, the Israelites. The darkness immobilized the Egyptians while the Israelites could go about their activities normally with light. This exposed the utter powerlessness of Ra and the Egyptian gods, while affirming the sovereignty of the one true God over all creation, including light itself. The 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn sons, was a judgment against the Egyptian gods Isis and Khnum, who were associated with childbirth and children. As the protector of children, Isis was one of the most important deities in Egyptian religion. By striking down the firstborn sons, God demonstrated his power over Isis and her supposed domain. This plague exposed the utter impotence of Isis to protect Egyptian families from the one true God of Israel. Additionally, Khnum was the ram-headed god who formed babies from clay and placed them in their mother's wombs. The death of the firstborn sons was a direct challenge to Khnum's supposed authority over the birthing process and the lives of children. Importantly, this plague carried deep spiritual significance for the Israelites as well. Unlike the previous plagues, they survived by virtue of being God's people. The final plague required an act of faith, sacrificing an unblemished lamb and applying its blood to their doorposts. This pointed to the future need for a perfect, spotless sacrifice, Christ, to atone for sin and deliver from death. By passing over the homes covered by the blood of the Lamb, God spared the Israelite firstborn while executing judgment on Egypt. This became known as the First Passover, establishing the memorial feast the Israelites were to observe annually to commemorate God's deliverance from bondage. So in this climactic plague, God dismantled the supposed powers of Isis and Khnum, while also instituting the Passover as a powerful foreshadowing of Christ's ultimate sacrifice to redeem humanity. Thanks for watching.